Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 209, and I am the show's host, Kyle. Sorry about getting this episode out a little late to everyone, but I got a lot of news to update today, especially coming out of Yemen, where the assault on Hodeida continues. This, of course, could spark the absolute worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world, and is something very important that we need to keep our eyes on, that at the same time a lot of people aren't aware of. Everybody's caught up at what's going on the U.S. southern border, and there is some importance to that story, no doubt, but we have a possible entire population that could potentially be starved to death here while everybody's heads turned in the opposite direction. So for those of you who want to keep your friends and whoever else informed on the issue, think about sharing the show or recommending it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or libertarianinstitute.org. Alright, so of course I'm starting off with the Yemen Civil War today. A very brief and abridged history of Yemen. In 1990, the country is unified under the rule of Ali Abdullah Saleh, who continues to rule the country until about 2011. It's also important to note that before Yemen was united, it was North and South Yemen, with the southern portion of Yemen being within the kind of Soviet communist axis during the Cold War. Salah is a strawman dictator and not somebody that, it would be renowned for his human rights records, or anybody would think would be one of the leaders that the U.S. would ally themselves with. But during the terror war, the United States under George W. Bush started a program with Yemen, and we gave Salah a bunch of arms, and he was supposed to use those arms to fight Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is known as AQAP and is often thought to be the most dangerous terrorist organization, at least to the United States and the entire world. And so, that George Bush says, I know, I'll start giving this guy some money and arms, and that way I don't have to get approval from Congress to send the U.S. troops in there, and we can make this real nice and easy. And I believe George Bush does carry out at least one drone strike within Yemen during his presidency. Now, Saleh takes those money and weapons, and I'm assuming does fight at least somewhat AQAP, but really spends his time fighting a group of people in northern Yemen. These are the Zaidi Shia. And by northern Yemen, I mean pretty close to the Saudi border. They're the Saudi southern border with Yemen. From my understanding, the Houthis mainly win, these wars are fought to stalemates, which are wins for the Houthis, and there's at least 4 of them from the period of 2004 to 2011. Now, when we get into the Obama presidency, he starts carrying out a heavy number of drone strikes in Yemen, and I believe there's some debate as to whether if any of these drone strikes actually targeted any Houthi leadership. Now, the Houthis are the political and militia movement that was started by a Zaidi Shia named al-Houthi, but he has since died, and the movement continues on in his name. Now, my take is that, or my understanding of the situation is that initially the Houthis were really a Zaidi Shia militia, but have since come to represent, or at least be the fighting faction that most represents a large number of Yemeni people. Not necessarily that, the Yemeni people have a blanket support for the Houthis and all of their tactics. However, that they may be seen as the lesser two evils or anything like that, because they're continue to able to recruit outside of their typical, historical area. So in 2011, the Arab Spring arrives in Yemen. Of course, this is sparked in Tunisia, but protests break out in Yemen, and the protests are truly massive and huge against President Saleh, with the people of Yemen demanding new, more representative leadership that they feel will make their lives better, because obviously whatever Salah is doing is not achieving that end. Now, the United States gets involved here. Hillary Clinton at this time is the Secretary of State, and there's a brief little section in her book, Hard Choices, about Yemen. But the United States decides that the best policy for Yemen would be, and I guess, the way they see it is, and they'll sell this and say it in a way that most Americans believe it's even good for the Yemeni people. And they say, we need stabilization in the region. And the easiest way to achieve this is to just tell, Saleh that he's no longer in power in Yemen, and we're going to promote the vice president, a man named Hadi, to be the new president of Yemen. So Hadi becomes president, and eventually the United States organizes a one-man and, really endorses, and this is the important part, they say within the international community, this is a legitimate election in Yemen. However, Hadi is the only name on the ballot, so he wins like 98% or something ridiculous like that. For a few years, the people of Yemen, I guess, try to live under this Hadi government that does give some minority factions a little bit more power. However, Hadi really just kind of picks up where Saleh left off and, is corrupt and crony and benefits the people who he gets along with in his family and stuff, factions like that. And, things don't get better for the Yemeni people. And remember, this time, the drone president, Barack Obama, is carrying out heavy drone strikes and, saying they're targeting Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. But we know many of these drone strikes are killing innocent people. As I've explained before on the show, I think the best example that demonstrates this is Anwar al-Awlaki, and then his 16-year-old son, who was a completely innocent American, are killed in separate drone strikes. And so you could see here that, innocent people were dying in drone strikes, and maybe some Taliban leaders were as well. However, there's no trial, there's no justice, and even if these are American citizens. I think around the time of 2014 is when the Houthis really start to expand their territory and move into the capital city of Sana'a. Because when Saleh left power, when the Americans forced him out, and things in Yemen aren't the United States, and when Saleh left office, he didn't hand over keys to the military, a lot of the factions of the military remained loyal to Salah and not to the Yemeni government. And he went and formed an alliance with the Houthis. And the Houthis were able to come through and take the capital city of Sana'a and continue to move southward throughout Yemen and take at least a large portion of the very southern port city of Aden. And this would, for the Houthis, have cemented control over, for the most of the populated regions of Yemen. The Houthis form a coalition government with Salah, and I think, I'm not sure exactly what the power sharing agreement was there, but it seemed that the Houthis retained a lot of the actual military power and decision making there. In 2015, it's clear that Hadi has to flee Yemen. He goes to Saudi Arabia. He's no longer able to remain president and control Yemen, and at this time is really only president of, kind of in name only. The international community says he's president of Yemen, but he can't even step on Yemeni soil. So Saudi Arabia forms a coalition of, I believe, about 10 states in total. The UAE, Qatar in the beginning, Egypt and Sudan, along with receiving assistance from the United States and some other Western countries like France. And they begin to start a war against the Houthis starting in Aden. I think in the early days of the war, there were some kind of Arab coalition troops on the ground. In fact, at one point, a ballistic missile hit a group of UAE troops, I believe killing over 100, including a general or another high-ranking military officer. And I'm not sure if it was that event that prompted some of these Arab countries to start using African mercenaries and Colombian mercenaries, but this is essentially what happens. Is there are some people in Yemen, fighters, that are loyal to Hadi and willing to fight for him, but those numbers I think are pretty little, and they don't do it without being given large bags of cash. So for the most part, the groups fighting on the ground for Saudi Arabia are, mercenary forces. This means that the Saudi coalition relies very heavily on air power. This air power is made possible by the United States that provides mid-air refueling to the Saudi planes, intelligence, and this is something that I haven't really understood the importance of in the past, but I'm realizing that providing the intelligence for this airstrikes are actually something that opens the United States up to possibly violating some war crimes in a legal manner. Obviously, in a moral sense, the United States is committing war crimes in Yemen. We're also providing the maintenance on the airplanes. We're selling Saudi Arabia the bombs they need to carry out these attacks. And we're helping Saudi Arabia enforce a blockade of Yemen that's preventing commercial food and fuel and other supplies from reaching the country, and really slows down any kind of aid from getting in, subjecting the aid to random searches, not revealing what's on the list of banned items, and then forcing ships to go through second searches, making ships wait so long to come into port that the food or whatever kind of supplies are within the ships actually spoils. And so in this way, the blockade has been particularly devastating. In a recent interview on the Scott Horton Show, and I'll link to it in the show notes page, Scott interviews Eric Eikenberry, who's a former U.S. ambassador, and he explains that in the fighting for Aden, the Houthis don't really have air power. You know what I mean? They have ground forces. And so the way that you're able to fight and hold territory, if you just have ground forces and not an air force, isn't by fighting in open battlefields miles from the cities and the civilian population. It's by putting snipers in hotels and in apartment buildings and making sure that, whatever mercenaries the Saudis have hired to try to retake and occupy the capital city of Aden can't advance on your position. And it creates a situation where Saudi Arabia then has to decide either not to carry out the attack and just let the Houthis continue to control Yemen, which would seem to be the right decision. However, Saudi Arabia decides to go the opposite route, and that is, have to blow up an entire building and possibly, 20 or 30 innocent people to kill one Yemeni sniper. Before I move on to the next section of the war, I think it's an important time to just stop and say that Saudi Arabia at least sold this war as something that would be very quick. In fact, they named it Operation Decisive Storm, thinking that the Houthis don't have any air power, so we could quickly take them out and their positions, recapture the cities, and, regain control over Yemen. Now, the Obama administration didn't seem to have a real reason to want to go along with this. I mean, if anything, this is just a regional conflict between Saudi Arabia and their southern neighbors, and it may be good for business for Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, so we don't go in and tell Saudi Arabia not to do it, but we go a step further and actually really support, as I just explained, Saudi Arabia's and the Arab coalition's war here. The U.S. ambassador to the UN at the time is Samantha Powers, and she explains that the reason the United States gets involved in this war in Yemen is to placate, and those are her words, so if you want to Google New York Times and placate, you'll probably get this article, of Samantha Power telling the New York Times that the United States is placating Saudi Arabia because Saudi was concerned about the United States moving closer to Iran post nuclear agreement, JCPOA, which of course is said instead. One of the terrible ironic things about the Iran nuclear agreement is that the war fought to placate Saudi Arabia over the nuclear agreement is going to outsurvive the nuclear agreement itself, most likely. Another thing mentioned in that article that's very important is that the United States government analysts knew that when we got involved in the war, it was said to be long, bloody, and indeterminate, meaning they didn't know who was going to win or how long it was going to last. It basically was the Obama policy to do what, as becoming president, he said he would never do, and that is start an open-ended, never-ending war like Bush did in Iraq, and that's kind of what we are getting ourselves involved in Yemen. Now, the Obama administration never sought war powers for this, and I believe they basically just claimed that providing the mid-air refueling and the intelligence and the support for the blockade don't rise to the level and are just Article 1 authorities from the president. Saudi Arabia takes Aden, which becomes kind of the temporary capital, or what they're calling the temporary capital of Yemen. So, I guess for the international community kind of reasons, they say that Aden's the new capital. They also take the southern city of Taiz, and that city then remains under siege from the Houthis up until this day. And the war kind of stalemates there, and through 2016, humanitarian groups just say, hey, this war is getting worse, this war is getting worse. Saudi Arabia continues to carry out airstrikes, even in the capital city of Sana'a, and the northern Houthi stronghold capital city of Sada. Throughout this bombing campaign, Saudi Arabia just decimates civilian infrastructure, destroying farms and schools and sports complexes, factories that, process cereal, water treatment facilities, hospitals, ambulances, government and municipal buildings, bridges, roads, you name it. If you want to get an idea of how bad the humanitarian crisis is in Yemen, I'll link to an article written by Will Porter, or the show he did on Foreign Policy Focus discussing it. And he basically explains that, the situation for the people of Yemen goes from having a hospital 30 miles or an hour away to that hospital being 2 hours away because the local bridge was destroyed. But then, there's a limited amount of fuel. So, because Saudi Arabia is restricting the fuel from coming into the country. So it's a lot more expensive to travel to one place to the next, or you have to wait longer to get there. Then the next hospital in the line is the next closest hospital is destroyed. So now it's 4 hours to get to a hospital. but then now there's another road that's exploded, or, maybe the next closest hospital is on the other side of battle lines and you don't want to have to, try to cross between the Houthi and the Saudi coalition's lines. So it ultimately ends up being like a 10-hour commute to try to get to the nearest hospital. Starting in April of 2017, there's a massive cholera outbreak. And cholera is one of these diseases that I think it's viral, and it's spread through water, drinking unsanitary water. And because Saudi Arabia had destroyed so much of the infrastructure and the water treatment facilities and prevented things like chlorine tablets from entering Yemen, which, you put in the water and then it sanitizes it, stopping the cholera outbreak. People are, just thousands and thousands of people are inflicted with cholera. Initially, it was reported that there was about 1 million cases of the cholera outbreak here. That number is probably inflated a little bit, but 3,000 people at least end up dying. And those 3,000 people are the ones who made it to the hospital before dying. The other thing you have going on now is starvation. Prior to the start of the Civil War, Yemen imported about 90% of its staple foods and mainly only produced farm commodities like coffee, which, are great if you have international trade. But as Scott Horton explains, if you're blockaded, it's a huge disadvantage. And remember, Saudi Arabia has also bombed farms. So, if you're saying, well, can't the Yemeni people just start growing something like wheat or their equivalent of wheat, which is sorghum? And the answer is probably yes. However, since all the farm equipment, the farms have been blown up and a lot of the farmers have probably been killed or, have decided to go take up arms, there's really just, no way for the Yemeni people to produce a lot of food in their own country. So, of course, food prices start to rise as you have scarcity. And Saudi Arabia, as I explained before, is really preventing food from entering the country, and only aid food is allowed to enter. Another development around this time in the Yemen Civil War is that the Central Bank of Yemen, the leader of the Central Bank of Yemen is fired by the internationally recognized president Hadi, and Hadi reestablishes a new central bank in the southern city of Aden. Now, the central bank in Sana'a, before the head of that bank was fired and everything, was trying to remain neutral in the conflict and I guess, continue to pay the salaries of public servants and stuff like that. So now there's a lot of people in Yemen who lost, especially in northern Yemen, lost their source of income and, were no longer getting their monthly payments from the Yemeni from the government. And so now you just have more and more people being placed on the, in need of food aid because they don't have money to buy their own food anymore, putting definitely more stress on that system. This is the biggest problem for the children, obviously, where we have, I believe now, I've seen estimates of 400,000 children that are severely malnourished. And while that may not sound like a serious thing, I mean, these are kids who are in hunger pain all day long. And they can't even just, even if their parents were given food, that's not good enough because most of the time, because of the biological systems that happen, the way the stomach reacts, you can't just eat food. You have to be given, treatments. And I believe they have like this peanut butter kind of paste that's supposed to be super nutrient rich and just, packs the most caloric and nutrient power punch that you could possibly, give in a small bar. But these treatments are very expensive, and you read story after story during this time of families trying to decide whether to buy food for their starving children or to try to get cholera treatment for their children that are ill with cholera. As I said, at the start of this section, the war is really stalemated up until December of 2017. And that's when Salah switches sides and, I guess once again gets international approval from Saudi Arabia and tries to, regain control of the Houthi territories. And I guess this would be the way Saudi Arabia would decide to end the Yemeni Civil War. However, it turns out that I guess Salah wasn't as popular as Saudi Arabia and himself thought and was killed by the Houthis pretty quickly. From what I read, it suggests that the tribal fighters did take a side in the conflict, and that meant the Houthis were going to win. Salah is killed along with most of his, politically connected family members. I believe like 5 or 6 of his brothers are killed by the Houthis, and one of the few people that escape are one of his nephews. You have a really interesting situation post. It seems that most of the people and most of the soldiers that were a part of the Salah Houthi coalition end up sticking with the Houthis. And there are some fighters that end up remaining loyal to the Salah family name and are now actually fighting alongside one of Salah's nephews. But the Houthis really don't lose any territory during this transition of power. And I think we start to see a little bit of a shift in the Arab coalition, and that is the UAE taking a little bit more power in charge of the decision making here, and decide that they're going to start an offensive moving up the west coast of Yemen towards the city of Al-Hodeida. Al-Hodeida is the key port city in Yemen. It's there's only 2 ports in Yemen that take container ships, one in Aden and the one in Hodeida. Hodeida was the only one that serviced the people of northern Yemen under Houthi control, which I should mention is about 2/3 to 3/4 of the population. I believe about 18 million people or so. And I have seen these numbers as high as 22 million as well, but 18 to 19 is the one that I think seems to be most accurate. And at first, this offensive is slow moving. However, the coalition eventually gets to the coastal plains of Yemen, and this basically means that the Houthis really don't have any ability to hide from the superior air power of the Saudi UAE coalition, and are forced more or less to just retreat up the coast to the city of Hodeida. Now, there is a problem here, and that is the countermeasure for the Houthis is that they lay mines everywhere, and these present a huge problem to the civilian population, who end up stepping on and being killed by these mines, and I'm sure will continue to die from these mines years after the war. However, this is, kind of one of the things that you have when you have a group like the Houthis who I don't think it's fair to just call them an insurgency because, they've held on to a large portion of Yemen for a very long time. But because they don't have an air force and don't have a navy and don't have any international recognition, use, these more insurgent-like tactics. And so now they've fallen back into the city. Right around June 12th, when Trump is out shaking hands with Kim Jong-un, he's really turning his bat to Yemen in more ways than one, and greenlighting the UAE, bat invasion of the city of Hodeida. International aid groups have warned that, this is going to create battle lines around the cities, as we already see the UAE's planned tactic is to cut all the supply lines to the city. That not only means that the Houthis will no longer be able to get military supplies and fighters into the city, but also means that, if there is any cargo coming into the port, in the city, it's not going to be able to get to the people of the rest of Yemen. The city itself could, at least prior to the invasion, had 600,000 people. I've read anywhere between 25,000 and 100,000 of those people have already fled and are now displaced. But, the Trump administration says, okay, take the city, even though aid groups are warning that, we could see by the end of the year that 18 or so million people in Yemen are starving. The current news is, so far, the actual UAE attack doesn't seem to be going all that well. I think we're about a week into it now, and they're yet to recapture and hold the airport in Hodeida, which rests on kind of the southern edge of the city and is really the first hurdle that the UAE forces need to overcome. I think it seems like Eric Eikenberry's analysis was more or less that the Houthis could hold out for some amount of time, whether it be, a month, 3 months, or a year. But eventually the UAE forces are unlimited compared to the Houthis and will just, turn the city into West Mosul if that's what they need to do. They may just have to completely flatten it, and then that's what will happen, and they'll claim victory over the pile of rubble. I think it's important to note that the spin on this is probably going to be, well, this is the Houthis' fault for not giving up the city. But I think from the Houthi side, and this is something pointed out by Bernard at Moon of Alabama, that conceding the port to the Saudis basically is admitting defeat in the war. You also have another problem that, they kind of portray this as if the Houthis gave up the city, then Saudi Arabia wouldn't do its thorough inspections and more food could get into more people in Yemen. But if you look at the situation in Aden, where even then, where Saudi Arabia controls the city, they're still very strict on what's allowed to come into that port. Many ships have to go through secondary inspections in Saudi Arabia or in other cities, meaning that it takes a lot longer, it's a lot more expensive and difficult to ship things to Saudi Arabia, or to Yemen, excuse me. I think a couple other themes of the war I just want to touch on before I wrap up here. The first, and that is the alleged ties between Iran and the Houthis. And if these ties exist at all, they're pretty small and mostly political. And while I say they exist at all, it seems that the Iranians told the Houthis, you shouldn't take the capital city, just look for autonomy in your own region kind of a situation. And after the, Houthis took the capital city, Iran said, now I really want to go south and try to take the capital city of Aden. But they did that as well. So even if, for Iran, it's politically expedient for the Houthis, that they're, really a thorn in the foot of Saudi Arabia, that works out well for Iran. But that doesn't mean that Iran has any special relationship with the Houthis or is giving them ballistic missiles, as the Saudis and Nikki Haley and the rest of the Americans have claimed. So the story of Yemen's ballistic missiles is that, prior to 1990, you have North and South Yemen. South Yemen is in the Soviet bloc kind of our axis or alliance of countries, and have Scud ballistic missiles sold to them by North Korea and the Saudis, the Soviets, I believe. Now, Salah has sat on those missiles for a long time. I'm not sure if he ever used them against the Houthis, but, throughout the Yemen Civil War, the Houthis have started to develop and convert those Scud missiles into ballistic missiles, and you can read reports from famed weapons inspectors Scott Ritter and IHS Janes that explains that these weapons are actually converted Scud missiles of Yemeni design and not from Iran. Now, occasionally they will, get some debris of these ballistic missiles because the other condemnable things that the Houthis do is they fire these ballistic missiles at Saudi civilian targets. Although, as of this date, I've never read a story of any significant loss of human life by the Houthi ballistic missile attacks against Saudi Arabia. But they'll find a piece of this rocket and they'll say, aha, it says Iran, and that means we know Iran is arming the Houthis. Now, what they neglect to mention is that there's also American parts found in these rockets, and these missiles exist on the these parts for missiles, I'm sure, exist in the international black market, and America, to a large degree, is guilty of proliferating weapons around the world, but Iran, to a much smaller degree, is also responsible to giving weapons to other militias and groups and proxy forces. Not that the Houthis are one of those groups, but, it could be sold to another country and stuff like that. So the case against the Iran ties, I believe, is very weak. The other theme worth mentioning is that, the political negotiations going on here really just haven't happened. The UN has come in and has tried to cut some deals, and it doesn't seem to me that either side is very interested in it. You hear more in the Western media about the, Saudi side being interested in these talks, but that could just be more of a propaganda thing, and the fact that the Saudi coalition has largely had a media blackout of Yemen, and has even at times kept a 60-minute crew from entering Yemen and, doing some journalism there. So it's not like anybody's really talking to the Houthis, asking them their opinions on the time. However, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, took a tour around the United States and met Oprah. So the last theme I want to touch on is that this is a war against the civilian population. And say what you will about the Houthis and their tactics, I understand that's a problem, but you don't get to starve an entire population just because you don't like the leadership that they pit. Especially when, really leading up to the Saudi bombing of Yemen, the Houthis didn't present a fight or a threat to the Saudis. Much like how the Americans would complain about a country like Iran or China or Russia being a revisionist power or being outside of the United States global axis of power and not willing to bend a knee to the American president. The Houthis may have been that to the Saudis, but they weren't an active threat to them. And so basically what Saudi Arabia, the Americans, and the UAE did is wage a war of aggression against not just the Houthis, but by and large, the people of Yemen. Nasser Arabi, a Yemeni journalist who luckily speaks English and is able to talk to Scott Horton, has estimated that about 70,000 people have been killed by the conflict. We know that at least the aid groups say that 3,000 people died from cholera, and who knows how many other people died from cholera, diphtheria, and other diseases, as well as people who stepped on a landmine, people who died in Saudi airstrikes, but Saudi Arabia, obviously isn't going to out themselves and say, oh yeah, we killed 10 civilians over there yesterday, or just starved to death in their homes and their, deaths were never counted. So, who knows how hundreds of thousands or so of people died in this war, but it's brutal, it's ruthless, it's terrible, and the Americans have a lot of power to stop it. I guess we can't, without military intervention of our own, actually, force every Saudi and Emirati soldier out of Saudi or out of Yemen. However, if we stop selling them the weapons, if we stop providing the mid-air refueling, if we stop providing the political cover at the UN, if we end the blockade, because Saudi Arabia's navy is really limited, and a lot of it is the U.S. supporting what they call the rights of navigation in the Red Sea, but it's really just enforcing the Saudi blockade. Saudi Arabia's ability to carry out that war in Yemen is extremely limited, and in fact, they likely would have ran themselves out of bombs to bomb Yemen with had the United States not kept selling them more throughout this time. And I think one of the reasons why it's just not more known is that this is a bipartisan war. This is Obama and then continuance by Donald Trump. Both of these guys equally as awful, equally as responsible for what it could very well amount to be a genocide of the people of Yemen. I mean, not to be alarmist or anything like that, but we are talking about 28 million Yemeni people, 100,000 or so already dead, and now there's an attack on the main lifeline to 18 million Yemeni people. This could be absolutely catastrophic, especially in fact that, we still have these bombings going on by Saudi Arabia. Just a couple months ago, they blew up a wedding with a U.S.-made bomb. I believe it was October of 2016 that they blew up a funeral home with a U.S.-made bomb. It could end. It needs to. And, hopefully those people will eventually be able to go on and live their lives like any American would expect. All right, that's where I wrap up the show today. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com for those of you who want to share the show. libertarianinstitute.org. Really check out those guys. They're really helping to promote my show, and I really appreciate it. libertarianinstitute.org. They have a Twitter handle. Scott Horton, Twitter handle Scott Horton Show, runs the institute and is a great guy and does great work on foreign policy and has really helped me understand things so much better. They also have a Facebook page. You can find my Facebook page, Libertarian Union, out there with a bunch of other great libertarian podcast hosts. I'm on Twitter at KYAAALE. You check out Immersion News on YouTube and BitChute, and that's where you can find the show on those sites. And my personal news website that I post links to all the time. I try to make everything very accessible and easy to find information on that site. So check out immersionnews.com, and thanks everybody.